great honor to introduce Brother Zamfin.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله ومن والاه. As Brother Ismail has said, we'll try and speak briefly each of us so as to allow more time for discussion. And what I have decided is allocate the time given to me to a brief story, or to tell you the story of Palestine in brief. My story is about essentially two things. First, why we have a problem in Palestine, and secondly, why it matters to the Muslims. The media generally speaks of the conflict in Palestine as if it were at times a territorial conflict, two communities sitting next to each other and not being able to come to terms with sharing the land or the resources. At times it is portrayed as if it were Jewish, Islamic, between two religions, etc. Now, far from it. It's neither this nor that. The problem in Palestine started with Zionism, a European product that had to do with developments in Europe, that had very much to do with problems that the Europeans were having and not being able to find a solution to. And then as part of their colonial campaign, they decided to solve the problem elsewhere. Europe had a problem with the Jews. The Jews had a problem because they were not being respected, they were not being tolerated, and that drove a few of them in the 19th century to think of nationhood as an alternative, and that brought about the idea of Zionism, political Zionism that is. We saw after that this idea of a nationhood for the Jews become espoused by the major powers of the time, and started becoming part of the planning in the aftermath of the First World War, which resulted in the destruction of the Caliphate, the Ottoman Caliphate, and the partitioning of its legacy among the victors in the First World War. This is the famous or infamous Sykes-Picot Agreement between the French and the British. And therefore, the conflict that is raging today in Palestine finds its roots not between the Muslims and the Jews, because the Jews before that lived with us for 13 centuries, no problems whatsoever. There were slight problems early on, in the first few years, formative years of Islam, but then from then afterwards, the Jews were part of the Ummah. They were people of the book who, and the Christians, became part of the Islamic civilization and contributed to enriching it in many ways. It is a European problem that unfolded in our own lands because of the developments that happened in the 19th and 20th century, and primarily because of the rise of Nazism, because of the Holocaust, and because of Hitler. And Hitler is a person that should be condemned by the Muslims more than anybody else, because had it not been for Hitler, Israel would never have come to existence. Had the Holocaust not taken place, the majority of the Jews in Europe would have still been convinced that they had to wait for the Messiah, as you will hear from Rabbi right afterwards, and that it was against the Torah and against the Talmud to go and establish a Jewish state in Palestine at the expense of its own people. The Holocaust, the horrifying massacre of millions of people, including millions of Jews, resulted in frightening the Jews and convincing many of them that probably the Zionist way was the right way. Not only that, the United States of America and the rest of its allies in the European Union hindered the path of Jewish immigrants in order to force them to go to Palestine. So you see, it's not a Jewish thing that really happened to us in Palestine. It's a global colonial thing. This is just to show you, and I know most of you, if not all of you, know exactly where Palestine is. This is just to give you a feeling, a sense of how crucial the geographic location of Palestine is. Now, can you imagine for a minute, that this part of the Muslim world, and look at the Muslims around them. I haven't shown all the Muslims in North Africa and the Indian continent, but this is such a central position that the Europeans would come and create a European entity in that central point and then get away with it? Can you imagine that to be possible? Not only that, can you imagine that that central position could at any time in history have been without a population, as the Zionists propagated, that this was a land without a people for a people without a land? Of course, no sane people would agree to that. The Second World War resulted in the mass migration of the Jews, and then we saw the Jewish armed, or Zionist, I should say, armed Zionist terrorists bringing about the creation of the Zionist state in Palestine with the mass deportation or displacement of the Palestinian people themselves, who today are scattered around the region and in refugee camps in Gaza and in the West Bank. Sometimes people think that the people of the West Bank and Gaza are at home, are in their homes. Actually, the majority of the people of Gaza today are refugees. There are about 1.2 million people in Gaza, this very small strip of land. About 1 million of them come from towns and villages that were destroyed by the Zionists in 1948. So this just gives you some sort of an idea as to what happened in 1948. This is the plan by the United Nations to partition Palestine as a solution between the Jews and the Arabs. It never worked anyway. Then we saw the result of what happened afterwards, the crimes committed against the Palestinians. I don't want to go through all of this. I encourage you to read about that. Brother Ismail Patel has written a couple of excellent books about this. I would urge you to get his books. There are many other books as well. This map shows you what happened in 1967 when the rest of Palestine was taken, the West Bank and Gaza. But I want to move quickly in order to save time for my dear colleagues and talk about why Palestine matters to the Muslims. Now, it is my understanding that wherever you go in the world, Muslims have three major things in common. And these, in my opinion, are the constituents of the Muslim identity. They are our aqidah, our faith. They are our sharia, the frame of reference from which we derive our way of life, our code of ethics, our code of morality, how we behave. And then this ummah to which we belong, and I insist it's a physical ummah, it's a physical belonging and not just a spiritual belonging as some people would like to describe it. Now, Palestine is linked to every one of these constituents of our identity, and that's why Palestine cannot be compared to the Tibet. Palestine cannot be compared to any place on earth. Palestine is a very special place, not because I am a Palestinian, but because I am a Muslim. Palestine is a special place because I am a Muslim, because I find it in my aqidah, I find it in my sharia, and I find it in my ummah. In my aqidah, when the Quran talks about the prophethood, and we are the descendants of Ibrahim, Ishaq, and Ismail, and Yaqub, and Musa, and Isa, all of them are our prophets. When the Quran talks about them in detail, and he talks about the area where they were, the focus of their stories is in Palestine. And when Rasulullah ﷺ was taken to the upper heavens in Al-Mi'raj, he could have been taken directly from Mecca to Al-Bayt al-Ma'mur, but he had to take a tour to Jerusalem first in Al-Isra on his way to the upper heavens. And in my understanding, this is very, very significant. And then there is the day of resurrection, which we are promised by Rasulullah ﷺ that it will be in Bayt al-Maqdis. Ardul Mahshari wal Manshar. That is promised by the hadith. Then in Sharia, who can deny that Al-Aqsa is part of our Sharia? لا تشد الرحال إلا إلى ثلاثة مساجد. You cannot make a religious trip to any mosque on earth except the three. The three mosques, Al-Bayt al-Haram in Mecca, the one in Medina, Masjid Rasul sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, and the one in Bayt al-Maqdis, where the Prophet ﷺ was taken in Isra, and where all the prophets were brought to him from the dead, and he led them in prayer. No other place of worship on earth deserves to be visited and made a journey, a religious journey to accept these three. Not in Canberra, not in Najaf, not in Qom, not in Pakistan, not in the United States of America, not anywhere in the world. All that is bid'ah, it's un-Islamic, and brought into Islam long after the Sahaba radiallahu anhum and long after Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. I'm concluding soon. Then we are taught about our salat. Our salat in Masjid Aqsa is 500 times the salat anywhere else. That's part of our Sharia. Our ummah, we share a history, the history of our companions. If you go to visit Palestine or the Jordan Valley, they will tell you this is the tomb of Sharhabil ibn Hasna. This is the tomb of this Sahaba, of that Sahaba. The companions of our Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, without whom we could never have become Muslim. They are the means through which Islam came to us, this guidance of Allah came to us. We're the ones whose blood was mixed with the soil, with the sand of Palestine. A shared history, a shared pain. What happens to my brothers, wherever they are, whether they are in Palestine or in Iraq or Afghanistan or anywhere, is my pain. It aches me the way it aches them. It is a physical union, it is a physical ummah, a physical belonging. And it's therefore a shared responsibility. It's not just their responsibility to do something about undoing the injustice done to them. It is my responsibility too, within whatever resources and means that happen to be available to me. Thank you very much for listening.
I always fear whenever we are on call to speak after Azam. So my sympathies are for the next speaker. But I'm sure he's equally talented and great. And I'm sure the content is absolutely magnificent. I would like you to welcome, please, John, who's a great advocate for the Palestinian issue, himself as Jewish descendant, and his work relentlessly since in cognizance of the issue. John, please, thank you.
Thank you very much, Chair, and I'm absolutely delighted to be speaking at this magnificent event. I've been walking around it before I came into the hall here today, and it's something very, very special. And I've got enormous respect for the Muslim community in Britain, for all sorts of reasons. But one thing that has struck me very much over the last few years is the way in which we all, after 9/11, came up against this horrific consequence that the United States and Britain were determined to use 9/11, this ferocious campaign right across the Middle East, to intensify their support for Israel against Palestine, to occupy Iraq, to threaten to occupy Afghanistan, and even to threaten to probably try, if they dare, occupy Iran. This domination, this re-colonization attempt of the Middle East that followed 9/11 is absolutely something horrific. Now, I, like many other socialists, joined the Stop the War campaign. And you may recall that before the build-up to the Iraq War, it was a fantastic demonstration. Many of you might have been on it. 2 million people came onto the streets just before the bombing started on Iraq. And what was extremely impressive about those demonstrations, the big one in particular, was the Muslim-non-Muslim alliance at the heart of the anti-war movement. Now, I believe that alliance is absolutely key to the issue that we're discussing this morning. It's key for an obvious reason, that we need this alliance. We need the maximum number of people across the faith and for no faith, people who agree about justice, people who agree about equality, people who are opposed to oppression, and indeed people who are opposed to imperialism in particular, because the maps we saw before about the way the imperialists drew the map and imposed their will on the Middle East, people coming together to oppose all of this. So there's tens of thousands of demonstrators, Muslim and non-Muslim together, sent a very, very important message. But there's something else that's particularly relevant to today. What struck me on the biggest demonstration, I think it was the Muslim Association of Britain that brought them there with the Palestinian flags. Nearly every column of marchers carried the Palestinian flag. Now, I've been in Cairo, we were just discussing this earlier, I've been in Cairo for the last 3 or 4 years, at something called the Cairo Conference, which brings together Islamists and non-Islamists, nationalists, socialists, activists of all kinds, to discuss how to change the horrible world that we find ourselves living in. And there were many, many Palestinians at that conference, and I was amazed to discover that most of the people I met there had seen those demonstrations on satellite TV and were so delighted to discover that people in Britain who weren't Muslim, who weren't Arab, they were actually English, Brits, and indeed some Jews, were marching on that demonstration together, and that gave them fantastic heart. Because we know what enormous pressure the Palestinians are under, but that gave them tremendous heart. I think that's incredibly important. So I think the alliance that we have between the Muslim and non-Muslim community is absolutely central to all of the campaigns against oppression, all the struggles against oppression, but in particular to build a movement of solidarity with Palestine is especially important. And I want to echo something else that Dr. Tamimi said. I'm conscious of the time, I just want to touch, nevertheless, on a little bit of history. But I want to particularly underline the role of the British Empire in creating the Zionist colony. But Dr. Tamimi, a very, very important point about the Holocaust. It's absolutely true. The Holocaust is a decisive factor that precipitates the creation of the Israeli state. But something happens between 1945 and 1948, after the war, after the Nazis defeated in the creation of the Israeli state. The Allies in the war, principally Britain and America, had the opportunity to go to what were called the displacement camps and to suggest to the Holocaust survivors, of which there were tens of thousands, that they should be allowed to live in the Allied countries, North America and Britain, Australia in particular. Now, they did it in a half-hearted way, but very half-hearted. The Zionists went into the displacement camps first, and people shouldn't assume the Holocaust survivors naturally wanted to go to something called the Promised Land. That's not at all true. There were survivors. They wanted to go somewhere comfortable, somewhere safe. They didn't necessarily want to go to Palestine, somebody else's country. The Zionists got in there first, and the British and American forces and their officials just looked on in a benign way. As it became clear, it was quite useful for America and Britain to establish this Israeli state. And I want to explain, it's terribly important to see this link. I mentioned the word imperialism. It's terribly important to understand the link between the creation of the Zionist state and the role of America and Britain in particular. There could not have been an Israel without the support that America and Britain have given it over the 20th century into the 21st century. And I just want to go back a little bit, very briefly, to the First World War and the British Empire, because something very peculiar happened in the middle of the First World War. Lloyd George's cabinet, in the middle of 1916, converted to Zionism, and most of them weren't Jewish. Winston Churchill converted to Zionism. A man called Arthur Balfour, who blocked Jews coming to Britain in 1905. You know, all the nasty racist legislation. I'm quite sure some people here have experienced trying to get families into Britain. The racist legislation that's persisted on the statute books in Britain throughout the 20th century into the 21st century begins with something called the Aliens Act 1905, introduced by a Conservative Prime Minister called Arthur Balfour, to keep Jewish migrants. I'm from a Jewish background. My family got in just before 1905, but many more were excluded. This same man, 12 years later, towards the end of World War I in 1917, graces his name, or rather disgraces his name, to something called the Balfour Declaration, which essentially is the foundation document of the Jewish state. Now, how did it come about, this man Balfour, who's clearly anti-Jewish? He stops Jews coming in, suddenly becomes apparently a great friend of the Jews to let them go to Palestine. It's fantastically cynical, is the answer. Very cynical. He didn't suddenly become a friend of the Jews at all. He retained a degree of anti-Jewish hostility, as a matter of fact. And there's something else involved. You know this funny acronym, NIMBY, not in my backyard? Well, Balfour and the Imperial War Cabinet concluded, not in my backyard, we want more Jews in Britain. Not in the British backyard, we'll stick them in the Palestinians' front garden instead. Why? It wasn't, as they claim, because they're so friendly to the Jews. It's because Britain was about to dominate, along with France, that part of the Middle East. The British Empire was about to expand, having knocked over the Ottoman Empire as a consequence of the war, was about to dominate Palestine. And they saw, and they called it this, they saw a Jewish colony as something that was going to be a tremendous advantage to British domination of Palestine and the rest of the Middle East. They had a number of reasons. First of all, there was a kind of cynical, semi-Christian crusader reason. They liked the idea of getting what Christians call the Holy Land as a kind of trophy for the British Empire. There was an element of that kind of very unpleasant ideological consideration. But there was also something much sharper and economic and materially based. To their west, they were in control, because they effectively were in control of Egypt, they were in control of the Suez Canal. To their east, the British occupied what used to be called Mesopotamia, became Iraq, the British were occupying. Isn't it amazing? 100 years later, what else is new? The British were occupying Iraq, and the oil was coming on stream. And that's why they were very happy to declare themselves in support of the Zionist idea, because they saw the Zionist colony as an extension of the British Empire. Winston Churchill said it. He said, the idea of a Jewish colony in Palestine is good for the Jews, it's good for the British Empire, and it's good for the Arabs, whether they understand it or not. Well, as a matter of fact, 99.9% of Arabs did not understand it. They found it an extremely offensive occupation and have been resisting it ever since. And you know, the oil connection became very, very practical. In the 1930s, there was a particularly unpleasant British Army officer called Captain Wingate. He mobilized Zionist militias to protect an oil pipeline they built from northern Iraq through to Haifa, to take out the oil from northern Iraq, to use the Zionist militia to control the pipeline, to pump it out of Haifa, which is a port, towards Britain. And there you see the symbolism of what partly this is all about, to have a kind of, Israel itself sometimes calls itself a watchdog for Western powers, and that idea of being a watchdog on behalf of, firstly, the Brits, and then in the latter half of the 20th century United States, is symbolised very much by the protection the Zionist militias gave to that pipeline. And we see this same argument writ even larger in the latter part of the 20th century. When Israel is formed in the 1950s, especially the 1960s, the United States increasingly becomes Israel's principal sponsor. Now, I wanted to say a word about France. As Dr. Tamimi said, Britain and France divided up the Middle East. France became a sponsor of Israel, and something that people don't know. In the Suez Crisis, when Britain, France and Israel tried to knock out Nasser, Egypt's president, how am I doing? 3 minutes ago, okay. Right, okay. I think you get the gist of where I'm going with this. This is a problem for America and the West, this problem. We have to understand this. Just a quick word about France. France was involved in this. France gave Israel its nuclear technology. I'm going to go into kind of polemic mode for the last 2 or 3 minutes, because I'm conscious of the time. I want to make 2 or 3 very polemical points. First, about Israel's technology. I want to talk about the hypocrisy of the West in relation to Israel-Palestine now. Israel has weapons of mass destruction, Iran doesn't. Who do we pick on? Iran. Palestine has democracy. It's just elected a democratic government. No one denies that, the Hamas government. Everyone says, though, that's not a democratic government, let's tip over the Hamas leaders. Israel's got a democracy. Israel's got a democracy. Israel excluded nearly 1 million native inhabitants in 1948. Is that a democracy? No, it is not. It is not a democracy. Those people can't even live in Palestine, let alone vote for a Palestinian or indeed an Israeli government. This is hypocrisy. The hypocrisy is suffocating people in this country. And make no mistake, it's shifting. I was brought up in an atmosphere which was very Zionist, not just amongst Jews but amongst non-Jews. That's shifting. There is a change. British public opinion now says they want justice for the Palestinians. It's up to us to bring that justice, make it practical, build strong movements of solidarity to give expression to it. Another point about the hypocrisy. I don't know whether you recall, Condoleezza Rice, a peacemaker, came to do a negotiation with Israel and Palestine. She sat up all night, she boasted about it, to help the Palestinians negotiate with the Israelis to get their tomatoes out of a greenhouse in Gaza into Egypt. And she boasted after 17 hours, hard negotiation, she persuaded the Israelis. This is complete nonsense, a complete hypocrisy. And I was appalled to discover the degree to which the Palestinian Authority rests upon European Union money. Why? Because the Palestinian economy has been throttled by the Israeli economy. People are sick and tired of this. I will genuinely end on this. I just want to make this final point, and I make it deliberately as a militant and aggressive point, because we need militancy and aggression to respond to what people are doing to Palestine. I don't like suicide bombings, but neither do the Palestinians. The hypocrisy about this makes me sick. The hypocrisy is expressed in a very, very simple sense. And by the way, to say that Palestinians do like suicide bombing is racist. The reason why that tactic has been forced on the Palestinians, because if you give them F-116 fighter bombers, give them helicopter gunships, they won't need suicide bombers. That's a measure of the unfairness, it's a measure of the problem that we've got, because Palestinians don't just face Israel, they face US, UK, Israel. That's their problem, we have to help them. Thank you.
but we've got a really strong lineup and time is against us. Our next speaker really, he has taught me more than any book has as far as Muslim-Jewish relationship is concerned. I met him approximately 4 or 5 years ago. I invited him to a conference in Britain. He comes from New York. And I just went to the hotel to welcome him for a few minutes, and I ended up staying several hours. And I was absolutely mesmerized as his background, his manner of speaking, and his take on the Israeli-Palestinian issue. Please welcome Rabbi Wise.
With God's help, I pray to God that He should bestow upon me His wisdom, His knowledge, and He should merit me to be able to convey this to all of you, that we should be able to together understand and know His truth, the truth of the Torah, and to be able to convey this to the world, and in so doing, sanctify His name. Amen. First, I'm here, I'd like to thank very much the Islam Expo and all my dear close friends, Dr. Azam Tamimi and Imam Patel. And obviously, I met him a few times, but I've come to really respect him for the terrific work. And now, so this is all, I'm meeting people constantly, and every time I meet a different person of such stature, I thank God that God merited me to meet these people. And I thank you all for coming to listen to me. It's a great privilege to be here, and I thank you for giving me the time for this. Now, the issue is unfortunately a very, very broad issue. It's very hard to be able to condense in such a short time. I'm praying to God, just these few points I'll touch on, and I ask you to look, for instance, at our site, www.nkusa.org. You'll be able to see from all the issues that we're talking about and others about the broader of all these issues we're here. There's also a book that I forgot to bring up. There's a Professor Rapkin just put out a book. He saw us being beaten by a demonstration by Zionists. Reporters asked him, what is this going on? He's a Jewish professor. And so he wrote a whole book about the Jewish philosophy against Zionism. You just hold up the cover. Yeah, okay, fine. Now, it's something you should know. In order to be able to have a solution for any type of a problem, you must know what the problem is. You go to a doctor, he's going to give you medication, he's just going to give you aspirins, he's going to give you, if he doesn't know what the illness is, then he's not going to be able to take away. They may be able to cover it up for a few days, but they will, obviously, the person will get sicker and sicker. So we have to know what is going on here. You have over 58 years, really it's 100 years of conflict that's going on in Palestine. And the people, the Americans, the Israelis, everybody has what to say about this. If we're not going to, and it never gets solved, we're not going to know the root cause of the problem, then, God forbid, then it's very hard to be able to come to a solution, to be able to correct this. So I would like to expose something which you of course have heard already, but I will try to help you that you should be able to have a clarity in this. And that is the root cause of the conflict, the only cause, the only reason for the conflict that's going on, and that there's a rift between Jews around the world and between Muslims around the world and Arabs around the world, is one thing and one thing only. And that is this new movement of 100 years called Zionism. And Zionism is not Judaism, it is the diametric opposite of Judaism. And that you must know. So let me explain what is Zionism, what is Judaism. Judaism is a religion being practiced by the Jewish people. We accepted a bond on Mount Sinai with God to adhere and to uphold the laws of the Torah, which was given on Mount Sinai. Every human being has to serve God. This is the Jewish concept. Every human being was created by God, and every person, if he believes that God gave Moses the Torah and he holds not to kill, steal, commit adultery, idol worship, is a righteous man, he will inherit the world to come. We made it says in the Torah, "Atam tiwi mamleches kahanim v'goy kodesh." You should be unto me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. That means we accepted a bond of priesthood to watch 613 commandments. Very complicated, many things. And in that way, this was the bond called Judaism. If we upheld this, God gave us the land called Israel. He said, God said, I'm giving you this land because you're on a high level. I want you to serve me on this high level of holiness. And there's many laws of the land, giving a tenth of charity, letting the 7th year that you're not allowed to work till the land. It has to go all to charity. There's many, many laws. This is part of this bond with God. If we will not be worthy of staying, we're not on that high level of holiness, then we will be sent out of the land. And then it says, you'll be sent out of the land, just like if you will defile the land, you'll be sent out of the land as a nation before you were sent out. Because they had desecrated the land, they defiled the land. So it says, be careful, many times the Torah says, be careful, do not defile the land. Because the land, that the land itself should not reject you, so when you defile the land. So God kept on warning of this. Anybody who studies the Torah, just has a little patience, a little time, and looks at the books of the prophets, that's the prophets that's shared by you, that's shared by us, it's the prophets that have accepted, it's not somebody else that came along with something, it's the prophets. And over there it says clearly how the Jewish people were warned that they're going to be expelled, banished from the land because they're not up to the level of holiness. Eventually, they were sent out of the land. This was exile. With 2,000 years ago, the destruction of the temple. This was accepted by Jews. We've gone through the Crusades, we've gone through many periods. Jews asked the rabbis, can we make our own settlement? Can we create our own? There's a patience. God knows every human being suffering. When the time comes, He will stop the exile. The second it's possible, God will stop because He has compassion. God is compassion. That is His name. He wants people not to suffer. He only wants good. The second that it's possible, He will end exile, which at that time all humanity together will recognize one God and will serve Him in harmony. It will be a metaphysical change in the world. That is what a Jew yearns for. That is what we pray for, and only for that, to sanctify God's name. Our obligation on this world right now is simply to learn the Torah, study, be a good Jew, emulate God. Just as God is compassionate, we must be compassionate. That is Judaism, serving God. Nothing to do with nationality. We are forbidden to have a nationality. God said when He sent us into exile, He said, with the destruction of the temple, He said to the Jews, now you're being banished from the land, you're not up to par. And now, watch the Torah. There will be when the time comes, He will end exile, as I say. In the meantime, you are put under oath, 3 oaths by God. Do not attempt to make any physical efforts, physical attempts to return to the land, because you are banished as a father sends a son out of the house. He said, puts him in the corner. And He says, you must be there for 10 minutes. And if the boy decides to come in the middle, it's because he's loyal to his father? On the contrary, because he's rebelling against his father. God said, you are banished as a nation. We were put under oath. Do not return en masse to the land. Do not rebel against any nation. We must be loyal to every country we're residing. That's a commandment of God. And thirdly, we're not allowed to make any attempts to end exile. This was accepted. As I say, when it came to the Inquisitions, the Crusades, I could go through many times. People asked the rabbis, rich people, they said, we can buy a piece of land. The rabbi said, patience. God knows your suffering. The time will come to end it. Zionism started 100 years ago. It was a movement of people who are far removed from learning Torah, from observing the Torah. They hated, they abhorred, they detested anything to do with godliness or religion. Theodor Herzl, with his long beard, who didn't cover his head, who didn't circumcise his son, who wanted to convert Jews to Christianity, anything but just to get them out of this Judaism of godliness, anything that had to do with Judaism, he wanted to change. He decided that why are we suffering? Being that he couldn't put God into the picture, why were the Jews suffering? What's going on? There was a Dreyfus trial. The time doesn't permit to get into that. But he says, why are Jews suffering anti-Semitism? He couldn't see anything metaphysical, anything spiritual that God is doing. It must be because we're physically weak. Why did we have to leave the land of Israel 2,000 years ago? We must have been physically weak. Not because of the prophets. He didn't have to do with the prophets. The prophets he had thrown in the garbage. So what was the story? He said, we're physically weak. The solution is to make a state. And he decided 2 things. To transform Judaism by the Jewish people from a religion, from a spirituality, from godliness, from elevating oneself into a godlessness, into a materialistic thing, from spiritualism into a nationality, simply a materialistic goal. Get a piece of land, have a Maccabees, we're going to win gold medals on the Olympics, we're going to have a strong army, we're the strongest in the region. How many, you have nuclear, you don't have nuclear. This is what Zionism is, a total transformation of Judaism from religion into materialism, into nationalistic goals. If you take God out, what is your morals? Who gives you morals? What makes you decide that there's no morals? So they sacrifice on the altar of Zionism everything and anything that is precious. Human lives, Palestinian lives, which unfortunately, I'm not going to, the time doesn't permit me, so I want to tell you this also. As I said, we're forbidden to have a state, even if the land would have been desolate, it would have been uninhabited. 1 inch of land for Jewish sovereignty is forbidden. We're in exile. If it could be in Pakistan, it could be in anywhere in the world. We are forbidden because we are banished by God. We have to have one thing, serving God spiritually and praying for the revelation of His glory. That is what the Jewish goal is. The concept of taking a piece of land is forbidden anywhere. And in Palestine, it's doubly forbidden simply because it's going in the face of God, and secondly because it was inhabited by Palestinian people. And therefore, it's tenfold compounding the terrible crime that's happening there. Our hearts go out. I won't get so many issues, speak about Palestinians and many issues. The time doesn't permit. But our hearts go out as Jews, hundreds of thousands of Jews worldwide, from the day of the inception of Zionism, whose hearts were bleeding for the suffering of the Palestinian people and humiliated by what's being done in our name, which is a farce. What's going on in Gaza now. They want that the Hamas has to make a declaration. They recognize the legitimacy of the state of Israel. Why? If Germany would have taken over France by World War II, God forbid, and it would have been the French resistance, and then afterwards they would make a deal. Okay, you're going to stop putting bombs, and we're going to give you help. But you must also recognize that Germany is the rightful owner of France. I wonder how many French say it. The world would say that's ridiculous. Okay, they want to make peace, but you have to recognize it. Say, yeah, this is right. Why? It doesn't make any sense. It's just pure these forces of evil, like somebody said. Therefore, we have to understand what's going on here. I'm going to end. Zionism has an issue of transforming, uprooting religion from the Jewish people, which they've taken Jews from all the Arab lands. And we have again, look at our site. You will see how we get beaten. I have full of pictures here where the Jews are beaten constantly. You don't see it in the press. By the Zionists, they took away religion. They put them into kibbutz, and the Jews that they took from private lands. The history is transformed to make it into a militant history instead of religion. Everything they've done, this to the Jewish people, to the Palestinian people, you know what they've done. Know and understand it's a farce, and they're falsely misrepresenting what Judaism is. We pray every single day. Which we beg of all of you to know that God is the one who can accomplish, and we have God on our side, even though we may be frustrated and it seems that we won't accomplish, it gets worse and worse. God is with us. We have to pray for the speedy and peaceful dismantlement of the state and do everything what we have to get the world to understand that it's racism, it's not a religious conflict, because that's what Zionism wants. That they want you to call it not the Zionist state and not the state of Israel. Call it the Jewish state. When they made I can't go through the Oslo Code, they insisted it's called Jewish state. A Jewish state by Camp David, the prime minister, he wanted each state should be written Jewish state. So whenever you speak up, you're speaking against Jews, and you're an anti-Semite, and it's a religious conflict. Hundreds of years we lived together with the difference of religion. We all serve one God. There was no problem. There was no human rights activists. There was no human rights. And still, we had no problem. There was no UN. It's not a religious conflict. It started with the Zionist movement. It is a political, when the world will recognize that it's pure racism, then they'll understand that they won't be afraid, they won't be intimidated by Zionism to speak up, just like in South Africa when the world, it was a push from the grassroots. They said, understand, why are you letting racism go on, even if it's convenient for you? Now we'll understand, the world, we will talk to the world and understand it's racism and it's nothing to do with religion, but we'll be able to go up with force to the leaders of the government of the world and say, please, don't you understand what you're doing is wrong, and don't fool us and don't talk about Judaism, it's religion. This is pure. It's no religious conflict, it's political, and we should pray, as I say, for this speedy dismantling of the state, and we should all pray for the day when God will reveal His glory throughout the world, but all humanity will go up and serve Him in peace, in harmony and happiness. Amen.
Our next distinguished speaker, really, if I were to give you his CV, it would take me longer than the speech I'm going to give him time for. He is really an outstanding individual, and I personally have personal regrets that I was not even one of his students, and distance and the language of medium has really separated us. but he's the authority on Zionism. He's written over 8 volumes on the issue of Zionism. So please welcome Sheikh Abdul Wahab.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. I will try to be as brief as possible, though I will not yield to the terrorism of the chair. So I'm warning him from now. The basis of the Zionist discourse is to what they call iconize Zionism, iconize the Holocaust, namely turning it into an icon, and the nature of the icon is that we don't question it. In other words, it is an attempt at decontextualizing everything. So Zionism is something you don't question. Israel is a Jewish state, you cannot question. The Holocaust, you cannot question. And if you don't question something to understand it, then you really begin either to worship it or attack it. In other words, the attitude there is not a human, comfortable one. As a way of approaching this, I always quote Mark Twain's saying, said that Jews are human beings. Worse than that, I cannot say of them. In other words, I mean, the human aside, he's saying that these are human phenomena. And therefore, we have to look at all Zionist Jewish phenomena as social, historical phenomena. And this way, we contextualize them. And once we contextualize them, they acquire a human content. Because if the Jewish state is an icon, then you really cannot sympathize with it because you cannot understand it. And the only thing in front of you is either to worship it or to fight against it. Applying that, you know, I always try in my writing to see the Zionist state as a state, and I begin to look into it. Take, for instance, the history of Zionism. The Zionists have placed the history of Zionism with the first Zionist Congress. Now, we know through our study that Zionist ideology and Zionist thought really reached its completion in the mid-19th century on the hands of Lord Shaftesbury and Sir Lawrence Oliphant. And this is really recognized by Sokolov, who wrote the first official history of Zionism. The interesting thing about both Shaftesbury and Lawrence Oliphant, that they were both anti-Semites. And there we can put our hands on the matter. Balfour was an anti-Semite. Lloyd George was an anti-Semite. Churchill was anti-Semite. In other words, there is something there which Herzl from the very beginning recognized that the anti-Semites would be our allies, and he depended on them. Because what Herzl really was calling for is to rid Europe of its Jews. Europe had what they thought a Jewish question. The Jewish question was that the East European Jews started coming to West Europe, and we thought that this would threaten the social security of the country, and therefore, as Professor Rose referred, the Aliens Act in 1905 that would divert immigration away from England to somewhere else, and that somewhere else was Palestine. What the Zionists did was to espouse this anti-Semitic Zionist idea and try to give it Jewish content. But this Jewish content was not necessarily religious. So if you were religious, then you will go back to the promised land. But supposing that you were an atheist, a socialist, all right, you are going back to set up the government of the proletariat. Now, if you are liberal, then you are going to set up there a liberal democracy. In other words, the apologetics change, but one thing did not change, namely transferring the what was called then the Jewish surplus from Europe to somewhere else. And therefore, we can argue that Israel really is not a Jewish state as claimed, it is a settler colonial enclave. And that's how it should be classified, and that's how it should be understood. Now, for someone to be a Muslim, he has to comply with the moral dictates of Islam. For someone to be Christian, he has to comply with the Christian dictates of Christianity, and the same applies to Jews. Someone is Jewish insofar as he conforms to Jewish moral ideas. Now, if we apply that, say, to the Crusades, we'll find that it was not a Christian campaign. And that's why the Arabs, ancient historians, call it the Franks. In other words, so the ethnic colonial aspect to it. The same applies to Israel. It's far from complying to Jewish ideas. Rabbi Weiss has referred to so many dictates in Judaism that would prevent a Jew from invading and usurping Palestine and attempting to return. I think it's called in Jewish discourse, religious discourse, in other words, forcing the end, rather than waiting patiently for the Messiah to come to, at the end of days, inside, not inside history, but outside history. Now, if we look at the so-called Jewish state, we will notice that it is far from being Jewish. Its founders, to start with, were really atheists. Max Nordau, for instance, changed his name, I think it was called the Maximum Reach or something, to Nordau because he admired the Nordic mentality very much. And he found that the Torah is a repulsive book and that Herzl's The State of the Jews to replace it as the sacred book. I can go on with lots of quotations. Actually, in the 30s, some of the Halotzim, the Jewish or the Zionist settlers, on Yom Kippur, which is the holiest day in the Jewish calendar, would go and stand in front of the Western Wall, called the Wailing Wall also, and this is, in other words, one of the most sacred places, and they would eat ham sandwiches in order to declare that they are no longer Jews, that they are Hebrews. It's a bit childish, but at the same time, it gives us an idea. Now, the state of Israel, ask any religious Jew about how they keep the Sabbath. It has turned from a holy day into a holiday. In other words, it has been secularized completely. Pornography. Tel Aviv is considered one of the main capitals of pornography in the world. The Gay Pride Parade used to be in Tel Aviv, but since 2 years ago, it has transferred to the holy city of Jerusalem. I read in the papers that some rabbis there will sit on the streets to stop this non-religious parade. We have to understand the Israel as a secular colonial state, and it's in that sense we will have to move. In that sense, we have to understand it. Once we classify it as a secular colonial enclave, then our resistance is resistance because it is a force of occupation. And that will remind the world that what we are doing is legitimate. It fits into the pattern of colonized peoples rising against their colonizers. And the whole theory of Jewish rights and so on would fall by the roadside. In other words, really what I'm suggesting here is an Islamic discourse vis-a-vis the state of Israel and the whole Zionist phenomena. Once we say that it is a settler colonial enclave, then our resistance is not ethnic, it is not racist or anything, it's simply people defending their land. Now, some people ask me, does this mean that the religious dimension is dropped? I argue that the religious dimension can never be separated from the political. And in our case as Muslims, Islam has not asked us to fight against Jews or against Muslims. It asked us to fight against injustice. So we are fighting against them insofar as they have occupied our land. And that's what Islam has asked us to do. In other words, I also add that the invader being Christian, as in the case of the Crusades, we resist. Actually, I say, had the invader been a Muslim, we would have fought against him and resisted him as much as we are resisting the Zionist occupiers. Then comes the religious dimension. It's always asked, now, what's the way out of this? I think resistance has to continue, because once it stops, the occupier will continue. I mean, his cognitive map says that there is, this is the land without the people. Actually, before the first Intifada, some of the settlements in the West Bank produced a map of the settlements and an advertisement for people to come. To start with, the map did not have one single reference to any Arab village. It was completely empty. It was really a land without people. But the funny thing that when some of the new settlers came, they asked questions that had nothing to do with Judaism. There was a lesbian couple, and they asked would they admit lesbians, and they said sure enough. But the funny one is a woman who came and looked at the house to measure the level of spirituality in it, and she found out that there is enough spirituality that would last for 2 years. Unfortunately, she does not have an email, otherwise I would have asked her to send me that machine that measures spirituality. I think this has nothing to do with any religion, or be it Judaism, Christianity, or Islam. Now, this kind of secular fantasies, you have to fight against them. But at the same time, I think we also have to give the Israelis a way out. And I think the South African model can serve as a model, where the racist apartheid frame of reference is gone. Something like the law of return, something like the constitution of the Jewish National Fund that claims that the land of the state of Israel are owned by the Jewish people, and non-Jews can not work on that land, cannot own it in any way. Things like that will have to be dropped. Then Israel, after that, can comply with international law, namely dismantling the settlements, ending occupation, implementing the right of the Palestinians of return, And I'm giving the South African model because now South Africa practiced racism and apartheid for something like 4 centuries. But nevertheless, now the white parties campaign in black areas and vice versa. And a total collapse that was expected did not materialize. And as Zan pointed out, that the cycle of violence ended when de Klerk brought out the famous terrorist Mandela and told, all right, let us talk, and people can say, Israel did that. It poisoned our Mandela and put a puppet government, and when the people elected a democratically elected government, you see what is happening now there. In other words, there is hope, but hope cannot materialize unless there is resistance that sends messages to the settlers that there is no way for them to coexist with us peacefully unless they shed off their racism. وأقول قولي هذا وأستغفر الله لي ولكم.
For all the speakers to adhering to the time. What we're going to do is open up the floor now. We're going to ask some questions, but before we do that, I'm going to take the chair's prerogative and make a few announcements. The issue of Palestine needs action from us. And it's extremely important that we not become passive observers of information. There's 2 events that are taking place which we hope you'll be able to participate in. On Wednesday, there's going to be a demonstration outside the Foreign and Commonwealth Office at 5:30, just for about 1 hour. We need people to be out there. Secondly, there's a campaign by Friends of Al-Aqsa and many other organizations of sending a candle to Margaret Beckett, because apparently she cannot see what the Palestinians in Gaza are suffering from. So if she cannot use it herself to see the light, maybe she can send the candles to Gaza. Hopefully they can have the light. So please take on this campaign. A candle will cost you 10 pence and send it to Gaza. Finally, there are 3 books which will cover most of the stuff that I mentioned here. One is by Professor Yaakov Rapkin, who talks about Jewish opposition to Zionism. This will be available in most of the stores. Second one, Political Zionism by John Ross. The second one is by John Ross. The Myth of Zionism, again, it's at Friends of Al-Aqsa store, and a few others, but I've sent it to the Friends of Al-Aqsa store. And finally, for those who just want the background, the Palestinian issue, Palestine Beginner's Guide, again at Friends of Al-Aqsa store. So we haven't got much time, about 10 minutes before the next session starts here. So if you can raise your hand, I'm going to take 3 questions and then ask you our colleague. Yeah, okay, you can stand up. Can you give to the sister at the back first? Stand up.
What I can see today, isn't America and Britain repeating the history again, taking oils from Iraq and trying to control again the Muslim countries by bombing Iraq, and this is what it's all about. They're trying to repeat the history again. Britain and America is involved again with the rest of the countries.
Thank you very much.
Professor Rapkin, one of the author of one of the books that got mentioned, I just wanted to say that when one explains what has been explained today, many people understand, and I think it's very healthy. I'd like to congratulate the organizers for enabling the audience to see that the conflict is not between 2 religions, it's a conflict of a totally different nature. And I must say, without that it may appear somewhat immodest, I published the book 2 years ago in French. I wrote it in French. It has appeared in 5 languages since, more are coming. There is an Arabic edition. And I mentioned that because the world is open to hear these arguments. They are not terribly well available, but they are. And I'm very pleased that today we've heard, both from the audience and from the floor, a very important distinction that it is not a religious conflict, it's something very, very different.
A question to our brothers, the rabbi. Why we don't see a public relation movement to you rabbis? Because, to be honest, the problem is, I mean, personally, I only see you when you're talking to Muslims. I'm not with you all the time, but I'd like to see you on TV. I'd like to see there's actually a website. I'd like to see there's actually a movement that we really can, refer to. Because at the moment, the only thing we know is, Israel and the Zionists and things like that. We want to see you more public, guys.
To understand this dimension, and it makes it much more difficult for the Palestinians. They're not just fighting Israel, they're fighting US, UK, Israel. This is their problem, we have to support them. We can stop them. In the end, we have the immense numbers. We very nearly stopped, the anti-war movement very nearly stopped Blair putting British troops into Iraq. I think they're hesitating over Iran because Bush is being told by Blair he's not sure he can carry public opinion. He's on a bit of a knife edge. We need to really build this movement. Ordinary people can stop them. There's a very famous English poet called Shelley. He had a wonderful ending to a poem. He's a radical poet. He said, "We are the many, they are the few." Let's not forget that.
One more questions? Keep your hands up, please. Brother right at the back there. Go there. And the brother on that right-hand side after that. And one here. Start from there.
I just would like to ask the rabbi, as well as the Muslim panel, what sort of effort are you actually making amongst the youth to get rid of this ignorance that it's not a religious war, but it's a political war?
Are you talking about Jewish youngsters? Or?
Both Jewish and the Muslim youngsters.
Thanks very much. There's a brother far, and I'm sorry to make you walk around there, but
Assalamu alaikum and shalom to our Jewish brothers. One thing I just wanted to say is one of the speakers touched on a point how without modern weaponry, Palestinians come to rely on suicide bombing. All I wanted to say was that we should be very careful not to associate the righteous struggle of free Palestine with haram action of suicide. In Judaism, Islam and Christianity, we all know suicide is haram. So I'd just like to point that out. Thank you.
can you ask behind you?
The rabbi has clearly explained that Zionism contradicts Judaism. If you could please explain in terms of ratio as to how many Jews agree with what he says.
Two specific questions to the rabbi in very briefly, if you haven't got time, because the next session is going to start here. First is there any work being done for youth? And second, what percentage take the stance?
It's for us, as I say, it's nothing new. With God's help, we convey this. We teach out. It's one of the our basics of Judaism. We have a fast day once a year throughout the world. We fast because of the creation of the state of Israel, and it's constantly spoken about in all the schools throughout the world. We burn the Israeli flag, mind you, on the holiday of Purim around the world. You can see that. This is we do in our youth. They're born and bred with this. Any really religious person knows that Zionism is the antithesis of Judaism. You don't hear again because, well, first of all, if you look in our books, mostly it's Yiddish and Hebrew, they're really religious. But as a general rule, you'll find that even the ones who are intimidated by Zionists, that they send, that they go to the elections there or something, but they don't know the Zionism. The proof is that the most religious don't send the troops to the army, they don't have Israeli flags. But there's a very large community that stand entirely away from them. We constantly work on that. And the second question was, the second? Oh, yeah. Unfortunately, the minority of Jews are religious. Most of them desecrate the Sabbath. It hurts me to say it. And still, no, I would like to know by you, if first of all, if you would take, well, let's say by Christians, if they would take the Pope as an atheist because he's an eloquent speaker and he knows how to speak concisely, not like me, would he be a Pope if he's an atheist just because he's eloquent? So could he represent Christianity? Obviously not. If you take people who are desecrating one of the 10 Commandments, and all the commandments and everything they do against, they cannot, these people, the majority of Judaism, the Jewish people cannot represent Judaism because they're not upholding the Torah. That's clear. Still, no, they say they represent Judaism. Zionism is part and parcel of this of going against God. So we are a minority. At the same time, remember one thing: Judaism will never change, even if nobody upholds it. God forbid. Because Judaism is what it is. It's this religion. So they can't change it, even if they're the majority. It happens to be we have hundreds of thousands of people worldwide, which you can come. I invite you to come to New York, or go right over the Williamsburg Bridge. You'll see large communities, not one Israeli flag. Go to Stamford Hills here in London with a very religious community. I don't think you can find one Israeli flag. Wherever there's large communities, they're intimidated. Most people are afraid to speak up from the Jewish community. I carry glasses that are cracked because I was beaten a half a year ago in Manhattan. We went to demonstration. Many people speak up, it doesn't get covered. Many people don't speak up because they're afraid, they're intimidated from Zionism. Again, let us know one thing. Let's not get frustrated that we're not accomplishing. We are. We have to do, and because God requires us, and we have to know that God will accomplish. God is on our side. Let's pray to Him, as I say, for the expedient, peaceful transformation of the state to the indigenous ruling of the self-rule of the Palestinian people, so we can all serve God under the righteous own of the Palestinian people.
You want to take the final question, Zaman?
On the question of the suicide, in chapter 8 of my book, which is coming out soon, I discuss this in detail. There are 3 issues that have been debated by Muslim scholars and thinkers regarding these operations. First, is it suicide or sacrifice? And the majority of Muslim scholars agree that this is not suicide, because suicide in Islam is haram, but these are acts of sacrifice, and sacrifice in Islam is not only mubah, permissible, it's even encouraged. إِنَّ اللَّهَ اشْتَرَى مِنَ الْمُؤْمِنِينَ أَنفُسَهُمْ وَأَمْوَالَهُمْ بِأَنَّ لَهُمُ الْجَنَّةَ. The second issue of debate is the target. Which target is legitimate and which target is illegitimate? And the majority of Muslim thinkers and scholars agree that if the target is the invaders and the occupiers, then this is legitimate. As in the case of 7 July, it is illegitimate. The third issue, which I discuss in the chapter, is how useful is the tactic itself in achieving results, and I bring about a lengthy discussion about this. Can you say something?
I read once an article where the author, I think was who said that each army or resistance movement has its delivery system. So the Israelis have tanks, have planes, all kinds of military gadgets. The Palestinians have one thing only, their bodies, right? And he puts it in that context. I remember once there was a movie called The Little Drummer Boy. It's about a Palestinian resistance fighter who fell in love with a girl who has no values at all. And there was an interview in the movie, and a journalist asked him, "Aren't you ashamed of yourself to place a basket full of eggs with dynamite under it and place it in a market and kill children and women?" He said, "I'm not very happy about that, and I'm willing very much to trade my egg basket for a couple of planes and 3 tanks," right? And this really puts it very dramatically. I mean, how can the Palestinians fight against the occupation? I always tell my journalists who are interviewing me please tell us a way to fight against the occupiers, which you would consider legitimate, and I will pass it on to Hamas, and I think we will adopt it right away.
And that is the talk, everybody. Please, one more round of applause for speakers. And the next session will start here in 5 minutes. It's British Muslims and political participation. And unfortunately, I'm going to be chairing that session as well. So if you're willing to stand behind. Jazakallah khairan. There's some pamphlets as well being distributed. Anybody's interested. One more announcement, the farm in Palestine begins bed has been reduced by 50% this day. So if you go to the FAS, it's half the price.
Brothers and sisters, in this seminar one room here, we have a talk on Muslim participation in the political system. Next door, in the seminar room 2, we have a talk
outside the job center.
The next session we're going to have Sadi Khan, Anas Akhafiti, Mohammed Muhammad, and Salma Yaqub, and we'll be starting in 5 minutes.
Let's find out.